debating this are Singapore, who will be proposing the motion, and England, who will be opposing. Speaking for the proposition, our first speaker, Natalie Morris, second speaker, Peggy Powell, third speaker, Jonathan Clark, and the reply speech will be given by Natalie Morris. Speaking for the opposition, our first speaker, David Peters, first speaker, David Peters, second speaker, Tara Mounts, third speaker, Joss Avery, and the reply speech will be given by David Peters. Please welcome him. The judges.
A very good afternoon to one and all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we on the side of the proposition are against violence of any form, and that is why we say that the government should not negotiate with terrorists. Now, what exactly are terrorists? Terrorists can either be individuals or groups who employ the use of force and violence to achieve a certain desired objective, for example, the release of a terrorist leader. And there's a strong element of fear inducement when we talk about terrorist activities, especially in the deliberate targeting of civilians with their violent actions. For example, they often hijack planes and indulge themselves in hostage-taking, bombings, and indiscriminate shootings. And we include terrorist groups like that of Hamas and the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, we're not talking about the terrorists of yesteryear. We're talking about the terrorists of today, modern terrorists who increasingly have fundamentalist concerns and also have an extreme approach to international politics. Ladies and gentlemen, what does it mean to negotiate with terrorists? Basically, it's about holding talks with people with the express purpose of making mutual concessions and reaching a compromise. And we on this side of the house say we refuse to compromise, we refuse to negotiate with terrorists. Because as long as they continue with these terrorist activities and this whole notion of violence, rather than reform themselves into civil political organizations. And to prove this, they have to meet the criteria of having a prerequisite for negotiation, that of disarmament of all members, the handover of terrorist leaders for a fair trial, and the forswearing of all terrorist activity. And in the course of negotiations, if we see that these newly formed civil political organizations were to flout these criteria that I've just set out, then they'll once again be treated as a terrorist organization, and it will put an end to all talks and negotiations. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, yes,
surely most terrorist groups evolved from political parties, and if you put them back to
no, madam. If I will talk to you about, I'll show you later how in fact they do not exhaust the most of the alternatives that are open to terrorist groups, and in fact often resort to violence because they see that other people have successfully gained some form of forwarding of their goals from the use of violence. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, although we say we will not have any talks and negotiate with terrorists, we're not saying that we'll storm in on their organizations and shoot all their heads off and carry out summary executions. But then, ladies and gentlemen, if they do refuse to forswear this form of terrorist actions that they carry out, we will still forcibly apprehend them and hold them legally accountable for their actions. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the house, we say that we will not negotiate and refuse to negotiate with terrorists because it will undermine the progress towards peace. And I will talk about, first of all, how by negotiating with them, you'll be validating the use of violence. And second of all, how in fact negotiations tend to be fruitless, which my second speaker will talk about. And basically, as a team, we will prove that today's motion indeed must stand. So ladies and gentlemen, on to my first line, about validating the use of violence if you were to negotiate with terrorists. And under this, I have two main points. First of all, how their violence is morally reprehensible, the action of terrorists, that is. And second of all, because once you negotiate with them, a dangerous precedent is set. So on to my first point, ladies and gentlemen, about the
Would you not agree that however morally reprehensible the act of the terrorist is, equally morally reprehensible for the lives of citizens in danger is a moral principle?
But sir, what you fail to understand is that once you were to validate their actions by negotiating with them, a cycle of violence will ensue, which I will go on to talk about later. And therefore, you will be endangering even more lives of more citizens, more innocent civilians, instead of ending the violence there, which is your initial aim with negotiating with terrorists. So ladies and gentlemen, we often see, and I'm sure the opposition agrees with us, that terrorists use violence. They deliberately target innocent civilians to achieve their aims, which is what I've already set out today. For example, we see the Basque terrorist group, the ETA in Madrid. They killed over 800 civilians and maimed hundreds more. Similarly, the Palestinian Liberation Front, under General Command, led by Ahmed Jibril. What happened then is they were responsible for bomb attacks that killed more than 1,300 people. Ladies and gentlemen, these violence and killings are in themselves morally reprehensible, especially in light of the numerous alternatives and institutionalized means of airing these grievances, which have often not been exhausted yet. We're talking about things like the formation of lobby groups, rallying, publicity campaigns, the formation of peaceful protests, diplomacy, the formation of political parties, and even the recourse to the international community, which is increasingly a viable option with globalization. And this has been successful and shown to be successful with people like Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, the French blockade, and the Million Man March by the Nation of Islam in 1998. So, ladies and gentlemen, we say if the government were to negotiate with terrorists, you'd be sending out the message that targeting innocent civilians with your violence is forgivable. And we say the government should take a strong stand against this violence. We shall not negotiate with terrorists. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on to my second point about the dangerous precedent that is set once you begin negotiating with these terrorists. Now, when you negotiate with terrorists, you're basically sending forth the message that yes, in some instances, I will be willing to compromise with you. I will be willing to sort of give in to you in certain instances. And basically, you're implicitly validating and justifying the use of violence to further your goals. And that violence basically begets success, encouraging, therefore, a cycle of violence in the form of a continual threat of terrorism, whereby other groups also resort to terrorism, not as a last and final alternative, but maybe first sometimes, without exhausting their other alternatives, because they see, well, you know, they've done it, and their violence has begotten success. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're giving you things like how, when the Colombian government started opening negotiations with the Colombian terrorist organization, the FARC, what this did then was a sparking off of various attacks from similar rebel groups with the drug lords backing. We're talking about rebel groups like the Colombian Liberation Army, I beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen, who then sent forth their terrorist organization, their terrorist groups, went and carried out numerous bombings, nail bombs attacks, and targeted various innocent civilians, killing thousands of people because they say, well, you know, the Colombian government started negotiating with the FARC, maybe they'll do the same with us. This despite the fact that the negotiations of the Colombian government with the FARC proved to be highly unsuccessful in the end. But other terrorist groups were not swayed by this fact, ladies and gentlemen, because basically to them, this violence begat success. So, ladies and gentlemen, we say on this side of the house that as a government, you should not relent. Instead, you should make and demonstrate the strength of your stance against violence, against the morally reprehensible notion of killing innocent civilians. And in fact, that is why we say that the government should not negotiate with terrorist organizations, because then you will be perpetuating a cycle of violence, because then you'll be saying that innocent civilians can be killed because you want to achieve a specific aim. No, ladies and gentlemen, this shouldn't be such, and that is why we also say no to negotiations.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the House, what we've had from the proposition today is an extremely simplistic idea of the terrorist situation, because what they've looked at is solely what terrorists do, and what we, on the opposition, are going to look at is what motivates them. On both sides of the House, it appears we want to save lives, but our opposition today is going to be based on the idea that not negotiating with terrorists won't save lives, either in the short term or in the long term. Now, what I'm going to start with is looking at the points that the first speaker made in her speech. Again, this simplistic view. She talked about how terrorist groups would evolve into political parties, and that is the true solution, the way to get to negotiation. The problem is she's got the whole system back to front, because what normally happens is you have a legitimate political party who aren't being listened to, and as a result are forced to the extremes. That is invariably what causes terrorist action. No, thank you. And the idea that they're going to go back somehow is just nonsense. Secondly, this idea of targeting civilians. Civilian lives are being lost. Well, later on in my speech, I'm going to show you how our scheme will in fact save more lives. But again, what we see is there was no attempt to look into why people do this. She just said, people are dying, isn't it horrible? Yes, but we'll show you why their system will cost more lives, and in fact, sometimes terrorist action can be justified. The strongest argument we had from the proposition was this issue of setting a precedent. Now, there are several problems with this. One, the precedent, if it exists, will already be there because we've negotiated with terrorists before, so they're not introducing a new problem. No, thank you. But this isn't a problem anyway, because what we would propose is a selective negotiation with terrorists. You don't negotiate with everyone, but you have to negotiate with some people because they have a legitimate political grievance. Also, they said the situation would get worse, and what we're going to show you in great detail is under their system how the situation would get further worse still.
Point, sir.
Please.
I tell you that with selective negotiations, you're encouraging other terrorist groups to be even more violent, such that they can get the attention.
No, because what you do is you don't judge terrorists by what they do. This is the underlying simplicity in your case. You're only judging terrorists by their actions. What we suggest you judge terrorists by their motivations. No, thank you. So what am I going to show you in my speech? I'm going to show you that on a fundamental ideological level, a failure to negotiate never leads to a resolution. And in fact, in many cases, the lack of negotiation causes the situation to get worse. Then, in the absence of negotiation, I'm going to look at the consequences, both in the short term and in the long term. I'm going to show you that terrorists aren't all wild extremists who we should by definition ignore, and I'm going to suggest a new form of negotiation to help the situation to get better. So firstly, why does a lack of negotiation never lead to a resolution? What you have in these conflicts is two determined parties with strong views. Now, neither of those sides is ever going to capitulate entirely. It's simple common sense.
Point, sir.
So what you have to do, no thank you, is find some kind of compromise, or you will never solve the problems that exist.
Point,
No
sir.
thank you. But what is much more significant is how a refusal to deal with terrorists can make the terrorist problem infinitely worse. And what we talk about here, no thank you, is pressure and in some cases desperation. What you see is people who don't have their voices heard. They try peaceful protest, doesn't work. They are forced into violent protest to get their voices heard. So what happens when you ignore that violent protest? You push them to an even further extreme of violence, and there are several examples of this. For example, in Chechnya, where initially you have a terrorist group, the Russian government entirely ignores them, and pretty soon you have full-scale war as a result. Please.
We point you to the fact that the Chechen rebels never sought recourse with the international community, like in the cases of Nelson Mandela, like in the cases of Martin Luther King. It started off straight away as a terrorist organization, so it doesn't happen the way you say it does.
But what this shows quite clearly is that when you ignore people with a justifiable political grievance, you don't make the situation better, you make it worse. You push them to a further extreme. No, thank you. So now what I'm going to look at is the idea of consequences. And firstly, the immediate consequences in the short term. Let's get back to what the first proposition the speaker was saying. Very simply, that terrorists kill people. So what happens if you refuse to talk to them? Well, they carry on killing people, and what I've shown you just now is that if you entirely ignore them, they carry on killing even more people. So in that short-term area, you have a negative consequence. Then, in the long term, no thank you, which is that most terrorist activity isn't random. Most terrorist activity is the result of serious underlying political problems. And if you refuse to listen to the terrorists, then you are ignoring those underlying political problems. No, thank you. For example, the IRA. Now, in Ireland, you have a situation where a large part of the country is separated off, the rest of the country don't want it to be, and a substantial proportion of people within the country don't want it to be. So you have severe political tension, and that is expressed through the actions of the IRA. But if you choose to ignore that, you're not only ignoring the terrorists, you are ignoring the underlying political problem, and you will can never solve it unless you are prepared to deal with terrorists.
Point, sir.
No, thank you. Now what I'm going to look at quickly is the idea
Point, sir.
of support for terrorists. Please.
I put forward to it that because of the mindset of terrorists of all or nothing, these negotiations are going to be fruitless and they're going to keep on resorting again and again to violence.
Well, madam, that is just quite simply wrong, because we see examples where terrorists are negotiated with and where progress is made. I would cite the example I've just been using in Northern Ireland, where negotiation with terrorists, where the belief that you can carry on negotiating with terrorists even when they refuse to make concessions, has in the end led to a compromise and has in the end led to an improvement. No, thank you. But now this idea of terrorism is just, you cannot separate from society. You cannot say that terrorists are somehow mad and the rest of society are uninterested in them. Because what we see is there is quite often public support for terrorist activity. I'll cite the example that the IRA is funded by people in America. Terrorists are hidden within the homes of people where they are acting. So to separate terrorism from the desires of society is a false separation, and that's another reason why we should listen to them. So what have I shown you? I've shown you that refusing to talk to terrorists doesn't solve the problem, and in fact it makes it worse than it is already, both in the short term and in the long term. I've also shown you it's wrong not to listen to terrorists, because they aren't only indicative of underlying political problems, but they can be indicative of public opinion as well. What Tara is going to show you in her speech is, again, the legitimacy of terrorist aims, regardless of what their actions are. And she's going to look in detail at these issues at present. And for all these reasons, I beg to oppose.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if I were to walk in here with a ticking bomb and tell you in a few minutes' time, ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to blow you up into minuscule pieces, but you know it's for your good. I'm justified. You know that you support me. You really do. I don't think that you would be really convinced, nor would you be extremely happy, ladies and gentlemen. And that is precisely why the opposition today has got the case wrong. Because the so-called justifiability of terrorism that they talk about, we see, doesn't exist in reality. And I'm going to attack their cases in two main areas. Firstly, the whole point on justifiability of terrorist causes, and secondly, this whole point on we need to save lives, which the proposition agrees with, ladies and gentlemen, but which they have made futile attempts. I'll point out that he hardly touched our case at all, and in rebutting, ladies and gentlemen. So now on the first point, and they told us that there are serious political problems that makes terrorism justifiable, but he never gave us any reason, ladies and gentlemen, or real-life examples of where exactly this makes the mass murder of innocent civilians, the very innocent civilians that they so-called want to protect, ladies and gentlemen. Why does this mean, ladies and gentlemen, that if you want to protect them, you have to resort to this level of violence and this kind of action, which in fact undermines the very welfare of society that you want to protect? He told us, thank you sir, that most terrorist organizations start out as political organizations that aren't listened to, which is a fallacy, ladies and gentlemen, because what happened with Al-Fatah? What happened with the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers? The point is that these people resorted directly to innocent killing without even trying other alternatives. Other alternatives that do exist, especially in this world of globalization, ladies and gentlemen, because we see with increased media scrutiny, with increased emphasis on democracy and human rights, even if there are no local reforms, as there have been, for example, in Sri Lanka, due to increased domestic reform, we see that the Tamil Tigers sector of society has been given increased rights. For example, their native language has been recognized as one of the official languages in Sri Lanka. So we see that domestic recourse already exists. Furthermore, international recourse also exists, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore we say that by resorting directly to killing the civilians that you want to protect, you are undermining your very own cause.
What we see through groups like the IRA is that flags up international scrutiny of the causes, as was seen by Senator George Mitchell chairing the summit, which is leading to the peace process as we speak.
Yes, sir, let me deal with this point on the IRA, which is very interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because we see the IRA has already been given a lot of concessions. For example, it was given a wholly separate and independent government by David Trimble. But what happened, ladies and gentlemen? It reneged on on its own promises. It reneged on its own promises to renounce its own arms. And this is precisely where I tell you that because of the all-or-nothing mindset of terrorist organizations, they are more likely to renege on their promises and lead to an increasing escalation of cycle of violence rather than leading to the success that they talk about, ladies and gentlemen. And even in Ireland, we see that logically, because of the deaths that result by the IRA against their own citizens, there is increasing backlash of local sentiment against the IRA. Once again, this denies the very fact that this is what the citizens want. So now the second point, that we need to save lives, ladies and gentlemen. And they've denied our dangerous precedent point by saying, oh, we've already negotiated before, so that really doesn't stand. But the point is, ladies and gentlemen, that we do not want to entrench the mindset that violence is good, that violence will get you what you want. And that is why we say, stop it now. No more further negotiations with these people. And the same logic applies to selective negotiation. If you appear to be giving concessions to one political or terrorist organization, ladies and gentlemen, there is a clear message sent out. And that is the message that we say will lead to terrorist organizations to spring up all over the place. For example, what happened in Kosovo was that because there was a validation of the claims of the KLA, we saw an increasing rise in splinter terrorist groups in the area. And this is the kind of perpetuation that we want to avoid. So what we're talking about, no thank you sir, is an avoidance of short-term solutions, short-term capitulation. Because if you want to weigh up the few lives that we save at this present moment, which are precious, ladies and gentlemen, but because we recognize that lives are precious, we do not want this kind of validation of a terrorist stance that will only lead to the perpetuation of more conflict and the loss of more lives. Don't you agree, sir?
Well, you're talking about short-termism, and yet you are advocating ignoring the underlying political problems that cause this violence.
No, sir. As I'm going to show you in my case, we're not ignoring the underlying political problems. Because if they are, in fact, going to renounce this counterproductive means of violence against their very own citizens, then very well, we say, yes, we are going to listen to your requests. Our opposition is not to the value judgment of the kind of aims they want to achieve, ladies and gentlemen. Our opposition is to the destructive and counterproductive means through which they want to achieve these aims. And I'm going to show you that negotiations are going to be fruitless. Now, why is this, ladies and gentlemen? In my constructive, I will be showing you about the all-or-nothing mindset of most terrorists.
On this very point.
Yes, sir.
Well, negotiations have worked with the IRA. You can't
No,
deny
sir, once
that.
again, you did not listen to my point. The point is that despite countless concessions, the IRA has refused to give up its arms, and that is the point, sir. Now, to deal with this point, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, most terrorists, because of the extreme course of action and risk they have taken, refuse to give up at halfway house. They have this kind of mindset that either I get all or no can do. Now, that's why they approach negotiation tables with a defensive and brittle attitude. Yet the point is they cannot get this all at once, despite their impatience, despite their unhappiness, because of the extreme nature of their demands. And this means, ladies and gentlemen, a continual return to violence, despite whatever promises might have been made. And this means, no thank you, madam, that each failed negotiation also reduces the hope and faith in a long-term political situation. And I can give you examples, ladies and gentlemen, in the real world, where the Spanish government under Jose Maria Aznar initially supported negotiations with the Basque ETA terrorists. But because they kept on insisting that the concessions given were enough, despite the fact that the very people of the Basque Republic were already indicating through public opinion surveys that they had indeed reached a level of contentment with the series of concessions given, we see that ETA continued with its killing of innocent civilians, and therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the Spanish government was in fact forced to take up a hard stance. Now, this is especially true when we talk about the rise in modern day of fundamentalist terrorists that demand things like utter destruction of the way of life of the American race, or utter anarchy, ladies and gentlemen. And I can give you the example of Osama bin Laden, who protests against the way of the American life. Now, or, for example, Hamas, which wants the entire dissolution of the Israeli state. Obviously, ladies and gentlemen, these are extreme demands. And obviously, ladies and gentlemen, if these terrorists were to resort to such extreme measures and to take such risks, they already have given their all and have this kind of mindset that, no, I'm not going to budge from this position. And that is precisely why, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that negotiations ultimately will only be fruitless, and their own example of the IRA backfires on them on that point. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you, if you want to protect innocent civilians or the welfare society that you so purport, then we say take a hard stance. Do not negotiate with terrorists.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, there are a few things here today that we need to deal with, because the proposition have had a very interesting time, almost starting off as the opposition, because they put forward their plan, and then in their second speaker have gone on to say how our plan doesn't solve the problem of terrorists, without making reference to how their plan actually would. Because the point we're making here is not that we like terrorists, that we think violence is fabulous and the way to achieve everything. The point we're making is that something has to be done about the problem that exists now. Because we're not talking about this ideal world in which there is no terrorism at the moment, so we can only go forward from here. We're talking about a world in which there is terrorism and which there are these problems. Now, David's told you already how it never leads to a solution without talking to the people that you're actually having the problem with. How if you ignore it, it gets worse. The example of Chechnya going from just terrorist violence to full-scale warfare, and how it has long short-term consequences in the growth of this terrorist violence. Now, we've already said that we don't validate violence, as the opposition have claimed we do, but we validate the aims that they are achieving, and that we don't think that necessarily the best way to protect the lives of our citizens is to immediately ignore the terrorists that we've got a problem with. Now, I'm going to tell you how the aims of terrorists can be justifiable, even if their methods are not as we would wish them to be. And because they have justifiable aims, you can't just ignore them, decline, until they fulfill your very specific criteria of peace and disarmament and complete renunciation of any violent means ever. Decline. I'm also going to tell you how it doesn't set a precedent because we have this existing situation, because there is violence that is achieving some ends. We can't start from the example that there is no precedent already and we would be setting a dangerous one. We have a precedent that has been set, and therefore we have to tackle the situation from here. But first I'd like to rebut a little bit of what they've said, because they said that by negotiating with terrorists, you create more extreme splinter groups. Well, yes, we don't dispute that it might do, but they've ignored the entire idea of what will happen at the end of negotiations, because you get the bulk of terrorists, if you can get the bulk of terrorists round the table, you may have the extremist groups offset committing violence, decline, but if you get the bulk of the terrorists round the table and they negotiate with you and a compromise is reached and this compromise is implemented, the support for these extremist groups decreases. And they brought up this in the example of the IRA and said, now the support for the IRA is diminishing, decline, which was slightly factually inaccurate. The support for the actual IRA and their political party, Sinn Féin, is not decreasing, whereas support for the real RA, the splinter group that continued its violence campaigns, didn't agree with the peace process. That is the support that's diminished, because the compromise decline that suits the majority of people has been reached and people feel that concessions have been made. The splinter groups reduce in power and the terrorism reduces as a problem, because we got terrorists around the table before they decommissioned all their arms, before they renounced violence, and this brought about a real solution. And they said that the negotiations were always fruitless because terrorists always had extremist aims. Well, this was precisely our point about compromise, and if you can get the majority of people on side, then the terrorist organisations will support. Because David said in the speech how you need the funding, how you need the local community to be on your side, to hide you in your houses, to keep you going. And therefore, if the local community can be appeased with a more moderate solution through negotiating with the more moderate terrorists, then you can have a solution that will work on the ground, and support for the extremist group will diminish. And this is actually shown with Hamas, because its numbers were dropping rapidly as the peace process continued, and as the PLO and the Palestinian Authority negotiated. Hamas numbers dropped, and their membership actually fell during this period. Now that the negotiations have stopped, and Israel has said we're not going to negotiate with terrorists because this violence is going on, the numbers are increasing again dramatically. So you have to negotiate with terrorists to stop the violence, because the terrorists are the ones causing it.
We pointed to the fact that the conflict had already begun to escalate, and that was exactly the reason for the breakdown in peace talks, ma'am.
Thank you. That brought us to the third point. Your idea that it was because the terrorists had the extremist aims that the problem is unresolvable. This is fundamentally not true, because it's often the state that doesn't compromise as well. Both parties hold extreme views. The state in Israel says, we do not want to compromise on many issues. We do not want some of the things that they hold fundamental, and we will not compromise. And the escalation in violence was caused by someone going onto a holy site and disregard of the beliefs of the other side, therefore escalating the tension because of the state's action, not because of the terrorists. They were acting in response, and this is an idea that you haven't fully grasped, that terrorists are not an individual extremist organisation whose sentiments are not rooted in the majority of the population.
population. Because your idea says we have to wait till they become an entirely legitimate political organisation to do anything about the problem that's causing the terrorism. Now this is fundamentally defined the wrong way about the problem, because people are still dying while you go about this. And this comes on to the point about justifiable aims. Because if you look at many terrorist organisations, they're not all that far out of whack. They've been forced onto further extremist ground because their quieter demands weren't matched. And this was where they had the idea of the town of tigers. They said peace has been created in Sri Lanka because the government has made language concessions to the town of tigers. People decline. This is not actually the case, because violence has still continued in Sri Lanka because they did not negotiate these Tamils to create these concessions. They gave them concessions they thought the Tamils might accept. They didn't actually think what the Tamils would accept, and therefore the Tamils' aims have not been met by this agreement. So the Tamils continue to fight because they don't want the negotiations and concessions that the government has given them, because they want to negotiate for their own concessions and to prioritise their own aims. So it's a crime. You simply cannot negotiate with terrorists. You cannot say you will not negotiate with terrorists because you can create the right ideal on your own, because you can't know what people actually want without talking to them. And therefore you can't say we would wait until they've renounced violence, had a ceasefire given in their arms, because they've been pushed onto this extremist ground, because the government often refuses to recognise their aims, etc.
So basically you're telling us that if the government doesn't compromise, then they are validated to continue with the cycle of destruction and violence.
Thank you. What we're saying is the government has to at least acknowledge what their aims are and look at them sensibly. And this is why the idea of international arbitration is so important. Because the international person comes in as an outsider. He's not involved in the state side. Because the state can't judge what is fairly rational for them. And it may not be rational for the groups that want these changes. So therefore, if you say that the state has the right to decide which matters deserve concessions and which ones don't, you're putting the power into one party's hand, and that's not a compromise. And therefore, that's why you have the terrorist situation decline. Because terrorists are there because there is a huge mismatch in the size of the effects of the two groups. Terrorists are often the less powerful groups in society, whereas the state is large and powerful. Therefore, they resort to terrorist means because they feel they can't get their point across in normal terms. And you say this sets a dangerous precedent. Well, my idea is the precedent is not set by the dangerous people being negotiated with and stopped being dangerous and stopped killing, and a settlement that is agreeable to both sides being made. The precedent is set when those people originally felt the need to take up arms, because they felt unpowered in their society. They felt their justifiable aims were not met. It's not like they're going out there demanding something that they think is completely unreasonable. You only demand something and you're only prepared to go out and be a suicide bomber if it's something you really believe in. Therefore, the precedent was set when they took up arms, not when they put them down and negotiate a settlement. The precedent is that people already think that by using violence they attract more attention to their scheme. That's why we have terrorism at the moment. And you don't set any more precedent by saying, look, if we negotiate with these people, we settle. And the whole point is, it's on the state. The onus is on the state to have not negotiated with these people first. That's why they turn to terrorism. If they'd been negotiated with first, we'd rather have that solution if other people's aims could be dealt with before they turn to violence. But once they've turned to violence, what this means is to stop them as soon as possible. And that means is to negotiate. Therefore, I beg to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, give in, pack up. Why don't you all just go home? Because we've lost the battle against terrorists. We have, ladies and gentlemen, our government have to capitulate in the face of being held at gunpoint, ladies and gentlemen, and say, we're really sorry. Even though you're elected and we have a responsibility to you, we're really sorry. We just can't do anything. The guy has a gun, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't work that way. We cannot capitulate. We cannot compromise. We cannot lend legitimacy to the use of violence to push through political aims. Despite the nobility of those political aims, in some minority cases, ladies and gentlemen, especially in the light that we have other institutional mechanisms with which to petition the government, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at that. Because we never said we're going to ignore the underlying political issues that motivate some minority of terrorists, ladies and gentlemen. But we said that if they have a valid cause, the way to pursue that valid cause to success is not through the use of violence, but through institutional means. And if those fail locally, ladies and gentlemen, to seek recourse to the international community. So, ladies and gentlemen, apart from the fact that they never bothered to deal with my second speaker's case, what have they bothered to deal with, ladies and gentlemen? They've asked us one question: what stops the violence? And then, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to add another question to the discussion. What then happens at the negotiating table? Before finally, ladies and gentlemen, I deal with the point on what are their aims. Let's look at the first point. on what stops violence. They raised the point that we already have a precedent in the past, so we already may feel further violence because we've negotiated with terrorists in the past. But ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to ask you, do we want to further validate that precedent? Do we want to further justify the use of violence even more and therefore entrench the use of violence, ladies and gentlemen? We may have set the precedent in the past, but here we are voting on whether or not we should change that, to say that no, we're not going to do that any longer. If you have a noble cause, use institutional, civil, peaceful means to pursue it. If not, seek recourse to the international community, but do not maim, kill, mutilate innocent civilians, ladies and gentlemen. They say, well, we are going to set them on a path to more violence. But this, first of all, assumes that terrorist organizations start with the least violent alternative and then work their way up a ladder of hierarchies, ladies and gentlemen, to get more and more violent as the lesser ones fail. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We've consistently reiterated, and they've never been able to deal with this, ladies and gentlemen, that, hold on for a minute, sir, terrorists often approach political relations with such an extreme mindset that violence is often the first recourse. And he could never deal with my point of information on Chechnya, ladies and gentlemen, so let's see whether he can deal with it now.
But the fact of the matter is refusing to negotiate increases violence and kills more people.
Thank you very much. Let's look at what increases violence. Your own example of the Chechen rebels, ladies and gentlemen, began immediately as a terrorist group and was treated as one and never sought a place as a political, peaceful organization. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the forswearing of violence as a prerequisite for negotiation can and has brought into the fold terrorist organizations and advocated peaceful participation in the process of political reform with those organizations after they forswore terrorist activity, ladies and gentlemen. So it doesn't escalate if we place such criteria on that. We point you, ladies and gentlemen, to the fact that forcing Yasser Arafat to leave Hamas, the terrorist organization, to set up Al-Fatah, an independent political organization under the PLO, though not entirely successful, has nevertheless lowered the level of terrorist attacks, opened channels for dialogue, ladies and gentlemen, and begun a movement towards peace. We point you to the fact that every breakdown in the peace process was due to a renewal of terrorist activity, ladies and gentlemen. And they say, what? We should trust these terrorists to not renege on their promises, ladies and gentlemen. We bring them to the negotiating table, which is what I'm going to talk about next, ladies and gentlemen. What happens at the negotiating table? They say negotiations will make them peaceful. All we need to do is bring them to the table. But ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the nature of terrorist organizations, because they operate underground, it's difficult to demand accountability for them. It's difficult to ensure that they not make their promises. Unlike the case if we force them, ladies and gentlemen, to register, reform, disarm, swear terrorist activity, and register themselves, ladies and gentlemen, as civil political organizations. We can't trust them if they continue to retain the option of terrorist activity. We point you to the IRA. Numerous ceasefires have been broken, hold on for a minute, madam, because of the impatience of the provost and other splinter groups. We point you to the bombing, ladies and gentlemen, and we tell you that negotiations with the IRA fail continuously simply because they continue to retain the option by refusing to decommission.
And how are you going to make them? If they don't want to, you will continue the same level of violence, and your proposal
Thank you very much. We've consistently pointed out the fact that each and every time we force leaders of the IRA, like Jerry Adams from Sinn Féin, ladies and gentlemen, to forswear terrorist activity, he has given promises for a temporary ceasefire. And during the course of that ceasefire, ladies and gentlemen, we've had significant breakthroughs in the peace process, like the establishment of a tribal government. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, when we continue to allow them to retain the option by not going a step further and demanding disarmament, demanding decommissioning, ladies and gentlemen, so that they can match what they say with what they do, what we do is continue to allow them to break these ceasefires, ladies and gentlemen. And we point you to the fact that the chronology proves it, that when they have forsworn terrorist activity, we've had significant breakthroughs. When they've returned to it, ladies and gentlemen, we've had stagnation and decay, a renewal of violence, and continuation of the cycle of destruction, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you that at the same time, a lot of the demands involve the release of terrorist leaders who go out and kill more. So you need to weigh up the lives you save now against a cycle of violence that becomes imminent every time you give in to their demands, ladies and gentlemen, such as the release of the Palestinian Liberation Front leader Ahmad Jibril from Israeli jails in 1982, who then went on to declare a new jihad despite his promises at the negotiating table, and spawned a new wave of violence, leaving 250 dead. You can't trust them, ladies and gentlemen. You have to make sure they reform. You have to stop the violence. Now, what are their aims, ladies and gentlemen? First of all, we point you to the sheer anachronism of their logic. Most modern terrorist organizations, in fact, are very, very irresponsible aims that they're not willing to compromise on. We point you to the example of Osama bin Laden, whose basic aim is the destruction of the American way of life. Something, yes, we are sure, is particularly reasonable, particularly noble, and he's very willing to negotiate on, ladies and gentlemen. We point you to other examples, like Shin Wikyo, whose fundamental goal is the bringing forward of the apocalypse, ladies and gentlemen. Another very reasonable aim, which we all want to sit at the negotiating table and discuss, ladies and gentlemen, rather than clamp down on them and stand them out at the roots, ladies and gentlemen. But even if, in the minority circumstance, they have noble aims, we tell you the way to achieve those noble aims is through diplomatic channels. We point you to the fact that globalization has made concrete diplomatic channels available, so you don't need violence to pursue their aims, ladies and gentlemen. And our opposition is to that usage of violence to pursue aims. We point you to Nelson Mandela, who, in forswearing violence by the ANC, managed to push forward an end to apartheid. It can work, and we stand on the side of what works, ladies and gentlemen. Not on the side that perpetuates killing, not on the side that validates that killing, and not on the side that continues to be unashamed about it.
Madam Chairman, in this debate we've told you that renouncing violence, ignoring terrorism never leads to the resolution of the underlying political problems. We've shown you how if you ignore it, the situation gets worse. We've shown you both the long-term consequences, the long-term deaths of proposition are putting forward, and the short-term deaths as well. We've also shown you how the aims of the terrorists can often be justifiable, even though we may not be able to justify the means, and precedent set with the proposition we're so keen on is set much earlier and is unaffected by what they've said. Deeper, perhaps, than any of this lies two fundamental problems in what the proposition have given you today. Firstly, they haven't changed a thing, ladies and gentlemen. Not a single thing they've said changes the way negotiations are currently put forward. That's just something I'd like you to think about when they claim to be the proposition after this debate. Secondly, perhaps even more profoundly, their proposition literally does nothing. And I want to quote what the first proposition speaker said in her definition, because I thought it was quite a good quote. She said, what we're going to do is we're going to have these criteria for allowing certain groups to actually come to the negotiation table. These groups were disarmament, trial of terrorist leaders by fair trial of giving up terrorist leaders, and renouncing of violence. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they quoted the IRA as an example of this. We asked one simple question, ladies and gentlemen. How did we get the IRA to do this? We got them to do it by taking a chance on them. No thanks, John. We got them to do this by taking a chance on them whilst they were still terrorist groups. If their criteria had been applied then, before the process started, there wouldn't have been any peace talks at all. I'll take you on this, I'm very interested in what you've got to say. There would have been no peace talks in a second. There would have been no peace talks, no advances would be made, and the IRA wouldn't be currently in a ceasefire, would they?
And the continued scale of violence that the IRA continues to perpetuate proves that the chance that you have taken was a wrong one.
That's very interesting, you see, because the IRA actually aren't committing any violence whatsoever, nor in fact are the real IRA, who are also, no thank you, under a ceasefire. And even more extremist groups are not being quite so violent anymore because their support, no thanks, you've lost that one, their support is diminishing. Okay, so if we applied their criteria to Northern Ireland, there would be no peace process in Northern Ireland, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we've got one very good question, which the proposition have kept talking about and has kept irritating me whilst I've been sitting here. And this is the question of validity. And they said that what you're doing if you talk to these terrorists is validating them. You're saying that's a good way to do it. Firstly, we have never, ever said that we're not going to do things like imprison people and give them trials. because that already happens in countries which negotiate no thanks with terrorists. That already happens. Furthermore, does it really matter, ladies and gentlemen? It matters, no thank you, if a precedent is set, which is something I'm going to be coming back to later. But is there anything inherently bad about talking to someone if it's going to save lives? There's a very obvious, example. You are a policeman, okay? Someone calls you up and says, if you don't talk to me now, I'm going to blow up a building. Now, our plan would say that basically, even though you're giving in to what they're saying, you should do it anyway. And the way to characterise this is that they have always been deontological about this. They said a rule is a rule is a rule. No thank you. Killing is wrong, terrorists are wrong, talking to terrorists is wrong. And we've said killing people is wrong, terrorists are usually wrong, although they may be trying to achieve a noble aim. And certainly, ladies and gentlemen, in the short term, the deaths which will be avoided by our plan significantly justify what we've been talking about. Okay, so we go on to this idea of precedent, which is quite an important issue. Because the first proposition speaker said, very legitimately, that if we allow terrorists to bomb people, and then we talk to them, then it's quite likely that other people are going to see bombing as a route to getting mentioned. Now, what we say to this, ladies and gentlemen, is very obvious. Why are they going to see that? The failure in the political process is at the point where you need to turn to terrorism. I'm going to deal quickly with the idea that the proposition I've been talking about, that somehow you start really violent and work down and ultimately become Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela individually renounced violence, ladies and gentlemen, but the ANC are a very good example of a group that started out, no thanks, as a legitimate political group, ended up as terrorists precisely because they were being ignored. Nelson Mandela himself as an individual renounced violence, the ANC did not proposition. Okay, so coming back to my idea of precedent. If it's true that one group is being oppressed, then it's right that a democracy, which is primarily what we've been talking about, although we've had examples from elsewhere, it's right that government should listen to them. If they don't, if they're not getting fair representation under the democratic process, that's where the precedent starts. When the ANC member has to pick up a gun to get his voice heard, that's where the problem is, ladies and gentlemen. It's not when you start dealing, I'll take you in a second, it's not when you start dealing with problems that already exist, like the problem with the IRA, like the problem with Hamas, like the problem with the Tamil Tigers, problems which are there in the real world. It's when you start ignoring people.
We've consistently pointed out to you that modern-day globalization means that there is international recourse that can help, in fact, as another alternative.
Well, yes, you have, and we said, right, but why do international bodies get involved? And we pointed once again, ladies and gentlemen, to the IRA peace talks, in which the terrorism raised the profile of the issue significantly, so that there was a reason for international bodies to get involved. If a government is just ignoring, which is what you're doing, if you're just ignoring a problem, why on earth are the international bodies going to move in? No, thank you. And talk to them. It only happens, for instance, when either the countries ask for help, as happened in Ireland, as happened in places like Sri Lanka, no thank you, or it happens because the groups themselves are being persecuted. Which goes back to my idea of Chechnya. Because John said in his speech, you've never answered our Chechnya point, man. What are you going to do about it? And I thought, this is a really unusual thing. I've been criticised for being crude, so I'll say unusual. It was an unusual thing for the opposition to bring into their case. Because if they're going to talk about terrorism in Russia, then Chechnya is a very good example of where terrorism is justifiable. Because Russia, for instance, was an oppressive state towards Chechnya. If an international body has been called in to look at the Chechnya problem, you can bet their solution wouldn't have been to bomb the hell out of Chechnya in the same way Russia did, ladies and gentlemen. It would have been to negotiate with them. So, what is going to make terrorists stop bombing people? Well, it's concession. We've seen it in Ireland. We've seen it with the groups in Israel and Palestine. What is going to stop other people from becoming terrorists? Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, it's when you make concessions. It's when you talk to people. Because then the culture of support for groups diminishes. They become seen as more extreme, as we see in places like Hamas, groups like the Tamil Tigers, whose popularity is diminishing because they are seen as more extreme, and it seems like the concessions have already been made. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, and perhaps most importantly, If something is wrong, does that mean we can ignore it? No, it doesn't. And if something is wrong, does that mean we can sweep it under the carpet like the proposition have and hope some international body's going to wing its way in and sort out the problem for us? No, ladies and gentlemen, it absolutely doesn't. I beg to oppose.
Here's for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the House, there are three things that I want to deal with in this reply speech. Firstly, the issue of do negotiations work? Secondly, I'm going to look at the solution that the proposition have put forward to you and show you why it makes the situation worse. And then I'm going to look at our solution and show you how it drastically improves the whole situation. Now, firstly, do negotiations work? Well, the proposition said no, never. And they said it's because of the all or nothing mindset of terrorists. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that just isn't true. Because what we've seen in the example of the IRA is terrorists have to be prepared to concede something, or the public support that we've shown you they rely on will vanish. Also, they assume that everyone who's a terrorist is automatically a complete lunatic. And what we've shown is that there are several cases where people have been driven to violence because the other political institutions don't serve to get their voices heard. And we gave you the example of the IRA, and we gave you the even better example of the ANC. Now I want to look at the solution that they've proposed. It was essentially this: ignore the terrorists and hope they become political parties someday. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that won't ever happen unless you are prepared to talk to them, unless you are prepared to take a chance on them and concede something. But the biggest problem with this plan, by far, was the appalling simplicity of it, because it ignored two important things. Firstly, it ignored the reasons behind terrorism. It assumed that there can never be a justification for terrorist actions, and we've shown you there can. But most importantly, and most extraordinarily, it completely ignored the consequences. It ignored the fact that if you refuse to talk to terrorists, you will never find a resolution. It ignored the argument we made that if you ignore terrorists, you escalate violence further. What we've had from the proposition is a plan that doesn't look at the situation before, and it doesn't look at consequences. They don't have any realistic sense of the damage their policy will do. What, in the end, it boils down to is this view, a view literally of one moment. People are dying now, therefore terrorists are all wrong, therefore we must not talk to terrorists. But they've ignored the fact that their plan makes the whole situation worse, and they failed to answer our attacks on those grounds. Now to look at our solution, which is one of negotiation. Firstly, it solves the problem in the short term, because if we establish that negotiations work, and you can get terrorists into a ceasefire, look at the IRA. But secondly, what it does is it admits that there are underlying political problems, which we have shown exist, and it solves those fundamental problems. Also, our step of negotiation is surely one that should be taken, because we have shown you that terrorists often have legitimate political grievances. The argument against this was for the third speaker to throw examples of mad extremists who have loony views. And ladies and gentlemen, we concede we're not going to negotiate with people who want to bring on the apocalypse, but we are going to negotiate with people like the ANC, like the IRA, who have political grievances. And then they brought up the example of Mandela as a man who ignored violence. But as Joss pointed out, this is the best example for our case, because you have the ANC, originally a political party, forced into violence by an inability to get its voice heard, and we've shown you this causes the violence to escalate. So, ladies and gentlemen, what have the opposition done today? We've shown you negotiations can, and in fact, do work. We've shown you that the proposition's plan ignores the underlying problems and the consequences of implementing it, and we've shown you that our solution will save lives. So for all those reasons, I beg to oppose.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Now, we on the side of the proposition have never said that we are going to ignore the aims of the terrorists and their objectives. We have never said that we're going to sweep all these problems under the carpet. we agree that something has to be done to save people's lives, which is one of today's issues, as well as to take into consideration the motivations of terrorists, which is the second of today's issues in today's debate. But ladies and gentlemen, something has to be done. But what? So now let me talk about how best to save lives, basically an evaluation of the two policies that were put forth in the course of today's debate. Now, they on the side of the opposition have failed on their burden as an opposition to deal directly with the policy that they have put forth. In the first speaker, they didn't even say anything about it, implicitly agreeing with the whole process of our policy. And in fact, they blatantly asserted that our policy does not work, not taking into consideration how Yasser Arafat and Hamas, for example, has been a successful example of a movement towards peace, and how we've consistently reiterated that we're talking about dealing with the problem by urging terrorist groups to forswear terrorist and violent actions and rather converting themselves into civil political groups. And bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a technical point. We don't have to suggest a new policy. Ladies and gentlemen, in fact, on their side of the house, we see a shift in their proposal that they put forth, the whole notion of selective negotiations. Now, originally, they said something along the lines of how they need long-term negotiations to stop the underlying political tensions. But towards the end of the debate, what we saw from their third speaker is that we need to talk to terrorists before they even effect their violent actions in the first place over the phone, so that we can stop them from effecting this form of violence. So on the account that our policy still stands, that they shifted in their proposal of a policy, we say today's motion still applies. In fact, when we talked about a dangerous precedent being set because of an encouragement of a cycle of violence, they said, well, it doesn't really count because a precedent has already been set. But the point here is that you're entrenching the violence, ladies and gentlemen, because you're validating the whole notion of violence to achieve aims, which is something that we are against. And rather than this whole notion of selective negotiations, so you mean the precedent isn't set with selective negotiations? That was rather confusing on that side of the house. And in fact, if you want to talk about selective negotiations, they already said that you will negotiate only with those with noble aims. Well, those with noble aims will not have to resort to terrorism in the first place, because there are other notions of diplomatic and institutionalized means of furthering your grievances and airing your grievances, ladies and gentlemen. And they said that, well, you need violence to get round to the negotiating table in the first place. Kept on harping about the ANC. But ladies and gentlemen, the only reason why the ANC was able to effect change was because they stopped violence, and they hadn't gone through the alternative mechanism to petition the government, lobby groups, the international community, and diplomatic channels. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand in today's debate the motivation of terrorists. Terrorists are not forced into violent attacks because they were previously legitimate political parties that were not listened to. They couldn't deal with our examples of how other people, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, were able to use institutionalized means to able to air their grievances and therefore effect political change. And they could only give us examples of Chechnya, the IRA, and finally, towards the end of the debate, the whole notion of the ANC. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand the nature of terrorists. They're not simply moderate terrorists, where you can find a compromise, whereby they have reasonable demands. Because, ladies and gentlemen, like my second speaker said, and they couldn't deal